Good evening, and welcome to Frontier News Network. In today's headline, NBC has begun television broadcast testing, apparently made possible by one David Sarnoff. Connor, is this true?
Well, Sammy, it all started on June 8, 1912, when Universal, a film production company, was founded by Carl Laemmle. Moving pictures were nothing new, for they'd been around since the late 19th century. But Universal was not meant to stop there. Universal became the only self-dependent film company, being the first to cover all aspects of productions. Even in the first few years of Universal's workings, the beginning of something new was brewing. David Sarnoff was an employee of the Marconi Broadcast Company of America in 1915. He proposed that radio broadcast network whereby events of national importance can be simultaneously announced and received, and baseball scores can be transmitted in the air. In 1926, David Sarnoff's dream was realized when he founded the National Broadcast Company, which was the first permanent radio network. This began a series of frontiers being explored, one after another like a cascade, through this company's unyielding ambition. Sarnoff continued pushing as much as he could for greater strides in this frontier, and only 1 year after NBC's founding, it broadcasted the first ever nationwide broadcast and delivered Charles Lindbergh's famous landing speech after his historic transatlantic flight. NBC went on to host radio and serial dramas, and in the same year released George Frame Brown's Real Folks. 1927 also marked the release of Universal's first talking picture, Melody of Love.
So, would you guys agree that television was largely made possible by the furtherance of the radio network industry by NBC?
Absolutely. If it weren't for the radio boom that they brought about with their networking in the 1930s, we wouldn't have these newfangled television broadcasts. 1930 was known as the golden age of radio, which was in no small part due to NBC. NBC was the clear king of the radio waves, having the most tuned-in listeners spread between the two stations. The red and blue were so named for their respective colored pencil markings on maps. In 1931, NBC held its first experimental television broadcasts. Experimental broadcasts consisted of a statue of cartoon character Felix the Cat on a rotating disc atop the Empire State Building. These were conducted for hours at a time during the day, as engineers worked tirelessly to perfect the fine-tuned processes. In 1933, NBC moved into 30 Rockefeller Center. This was in preparation for putting together their sets and equipment for broadcast, marking another major step towards officially opening the frontier of the television broadcast. In the 1939 World's Fair, David Sarnoff made the penultimate announcement. Regular television broadcasts would begin in none other than NBC. He fittingly dubbed it a new art and a new industry, which eventually would provide entertainment and information for millions. This described very well what the frontier he was opening would lead to.
So what's next? Where does television take us? Led by David Sarnoff and the company of NBC.
NBC had opened up a wild frontier, and they weren't stopping there. They went from broadcasts of produced entertainment like serials into more ambitious endeavors. In 1939, the first Macy's Thanksgiving Parade was held, and it continued from there as a staple, always covered by NBC. NBC went on to spread to televising sporting events, fulfilling Sarnoff's original vision in a way he could never have anticipated. They televised the 1947 World Series, beginning the processes of televising major sporting events, allowing millions to gather around the silver screen at home and spectate. This time also marked the beginning of the Meet the Press broadcast. In this, reporters would host live, televised interviews with government officials in front of millions in the viewing audience. The significance of this could never be overstated. Sarnoff and NBC had opened up the frontier of a world in which Americans anywhere and everywhere in the country could watch and listen to interviews being held with their own government officials as they happened. What's next? Sarnoff and company did not wait long to reveal this answer, as they went on to begin to televise presidential nominating conventions during 1948, which was held on the Camel Newsreel Theater, sponsored and brought to you by Camel Cigarettes.
Oh, cartons of camels are sure to please. Besides, they look so handsome under Christmas trees. So easy to give, so good to get. Give camels the nation's favorite cigarette.
In the 1950s, the television boom came along. The percentage of American households owning television increased by a factor of 10, from 9% to over 90% by the end of the decade. Amidst this time period were a plethora of firsts for NBC, and by proxy, television. The first regularly scheduled daytime broadcast, the first female-hosted broadcast, the beginning of the Today Show, and the first crime drama serial. All of these set precedents for the respective histories to follow. NBC was a trendsetter like no other for television because they had the ability to determine how anything and everything would be done. NBC was blazing a trail in a frontier they had created themselves. Pat Weaver was an innovator in his own right for NBC, introducing the ideas of broadcasting from around the world being hosted on NBC for American viewing audiences, which meant foreign news and productions could be sent to the home of every American viewer for their consumption. In 1953, NBC began to work towards their next incredible landmark achievement, color broadcasting. This year saw the first official test broadcast in color television.
Just 3 years later, NBC debuted their official logo, showing off their colors just as a peacock would. This year also saw coverage unlike any other for the presidential election, hosted by Chet Huntley in New York and David Brinkley in Washington, each evening. The 50s was a push on this frontier with a very little precedent. The first television program to be hosted by an African American. Nat King Cole was given a series in which ran over for a year until funding was lost due to pushback on the controversy of who was hosting. While it may be considered a failure that the show did not become mainstay or secure funding, it still succeeded in pushing and opening up the frontier for more representation in other ways. This point would later be followed up in the 1960s by the controversially made Julia. This series followed a widowed African American mother doing her best to take care of her family while also holding a career as a nurse. In a time where civil rights was a hot-button topic, this was a very pointed and deliberate choice. This was an unprecedented representation, setting the stage for similar productions to come. Following up on another 3-year successes of Julia, NBC produced yet another broadcast with an African-American lead, The Flip Wilson Show. So we've seen all these firsts and innovations made by Sarnoff and the NBC in a frontier of their own creation. And so why does it matter? Television grew to become the largest media platform in the coming decades, growing to be the massive platform it is today. News broadcasts, government addresses, and history-defining moments are all shown around the globe through this medium. But the journey to this stage had to start somewhere. A medium in which representation for minorities and groups of all kinds is pushed for like no other time before. This would not have been possible if it were not for shows that were willing to take those risks some 60 years before. David Sarnoff left a legacy of a frontier, which has only expanded since its start, and allowed for so much to be done.
Thank you, Noah. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen at home. This is Sammy, Connor, and Noah from FNN, signing off.